A fragile beginning. The neonatal intensive care unit, NICU, was a place of whispered prayers and muffled cries. It was where Evelyn Shaw, a veteran nurse with 15 years of experience, spent most of her time. The quiet hum of machines and the rhythmic beeping of monitors had become the soundtrack of her life. She had seen miracles and heartbreaks in equal measure, but nothing could have prepared her for the night that would change everything. The Miller twins had arrived 3 days earlier, born prematurely at 29 weeks. Ava, the larger of the two, had been immediately stabilized and placed in an incubator. Bella, however, was frail, her tiny body struggling to cling to life. Despite the team's best efforts, her vitals continued to deteriorate. Evelyn stood at the nurse's station that night, her sharp eyes scanning Bella's chart. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a harsh glow, making the lines on her face more pronounced. She had worked countless night shifts, but this one felt heavier, as if the weight of Bella's fragile life pressed against her chest. She glanced at the monitors. Bella's oxygen levels were dropping again. Evelyn's instincts, honed by years of experience, told her something was wrong, something beyond the data on the screen. She walked to Bella's incubator and placed a gentle hand on the baby's arm. To her surprise, Bella's skin was warm, almost as if she was holding on, fighting against the odds. Evelyn bit her lip, her mind racing. She had read about kangaroo care, the practice of placing a healthy infant next to a struggling one to stimulate improvement. It was unconventional and not part of their protocol, but the connection between twins was unique, almost mystical. Could placing Ava next to Bella help? She turned to Sarah, a younger nurse who had just joined the NICU team. "I'm going to move Ava," Evelyn said, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. Sarah's eyes widened. "But that's against protocol. What if something goes wrong?" Evelyn met her gaze, her voice soft but firm. "And what if it works?" Before Sarah could protest further, Evelyn walked to Ava's incubator and carefully lifted the tiny baby into her arms. Wrapped snugly in a warm blanket, Ava stirred slightly but didn't wake. With practiced precision, Evelyn carried her to Bella's incubator, her heart pounding with both fear and hope. She opened the hatch and placed Ava beside her twin. The two babies lay side by side for the first time since birth. The room fell silent. Nurses gathered, their movements subdued as they watched the unprecedented moment unfold. Evelyn's colleagues exchanged worried glances, but no one stepped forward to stop her. Linda, an older nurse with decades of experience, approached, her face a mixture of concern and curiosity. "What do you think you're doing?" Linda asked, her voice low but sharp. Evelyn didn't look away from the twins. "I'm giving them a chance," she replied simply. Minutes turned into an eternity. Ava's tiny hand twitched, brushing against Bella's arm. Then, as if responding to her sister's presence, Bella's vitals began to stabilize. Her heart rate, which had been erratic, steadied. Her oxygen levels climbed, the monitors beeping growing stronger and more rhythmic. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. "It's working," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Linda stepped closer, her professional demeanor slipping as she stared at the monitors. "Dear Lord," she murmured, crossing herself. Sarah clutched her clipboard, her knuckles white. "Should we call Dr. Hayes?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Not yet," Evelyn replied. "Let's see what happens." For the next hour, the NICU held its collective breath. The twins remained nestled together, their tiny bodies radiating a warmth that seemed to transcend science. Bella's color improved, and her breathing became more regular. Nurses exchanged astonished glances, their skepticism giving way to quiet awe. But the fragile peace was shattered when the door swung open with a loud creak. Dr. Michael Hayes strode in, his expression darkening as he took in the scene. He was a man known for his adherence to protocol, and his presence sent a ripple of tension through the room. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice slicing through the silence. Evelyn straightened, her heart hammering. Bella wasn't responding to treatment. I placed Ava with her to see if it would help. Dr. Hayes's eyes narrowed. You defied protocol. You endangered both infants. Evelyn stood her ground, her voice unwavering. Bella is improving. Look at her vitals. This might have saved her life. Dr. Hayes glanced at the monitors, his frown deepening. That's not the point. You don't get to make these decisions on your own. There are procedures in place for a reason. Linda stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. With all due respect, Doctor, sometimes procedures aren't enough. Sometimes we have to follow our instincts. Dr. Hayes shook his head, his frustration evident. This will be reported. There will be consequences. As he stormed out, the room remained tense. Evelyn turned back to the twins, her resolve hardening. She knew she had taken a risk, but in that moment, she also knew it had been worth it. Bella's tiny chest rose and fell with newfound strength, her small hand clutching Ava's finger in a grip that spoke of life, of hope, of a bond unbreakable. The decision Evelyn had made in that quiet, tension-filled room would set off a chain of events that would challenge everything she believed in. It would test her faith, her career, and her very identity. But for now, she stood firm, watching over the twins with a quiet prayer on her lips, that love, and not protocol, would prevail. The weight of consequences. The dim glow of the NICU monitors reflected Evelyn's somber expression as she sat at the nurse's station, staring blankly at Bella's chart. The soft murmur of ventilators filled the air, punctuated by the steady beeping of heart monitors. It should have been a moment of triumph. Bella was showing signs of improvement that no one had dared hope for. But the storm Evelyn had unleashed was already brewing, and its echoes were impossible to ignore. The tension from Dr. Hayes's reprimand lingered in the air, unspoken but heavy. Nurses who had once greeted Evelyn with warm smiles now avoided her gaze. Linda, her closest confidant, stood by her side, silently flipping through charts with a furrowed brow. Sarah, the younger nurse, cast anxious glances in Evelyn's direction, but said nothing. You know they're coming for you, Linda said quietly, breaking the silence. Evelyn nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of Bella's file. I'd do it again, Linda, she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. Bella needed her sister and Ava. She brought her back. Linda sighed, leaning against the counter. You don't have to convince me. But the board, Dr. Hayes, they'll want your head on a platter. Evelyn closed her eyes, the weight of her decision pressing against her. She had always believed in doing what was right, even if it meant bending the rules. But now, the stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just about her career. It was about saving lives. The hospital's response. The next morning, Evelyn walked into the hospital to find the atmosphere markedly colder. Conversations hushed as she passed, and colleagues who had worked beside her for years offered only curt nods or avoided her altogether. The bright fluorescent lights seemed harsher, casting unforgiving shadows down the sterile corridors. In the break room, Linda approached with a grim expression, holding a folded piece of paper. They're fast-tracking this, she said, handing Evelyn the notice. It was an official summons for a disciplinary hearing, signed by Karen Russell, the hospital administrator. Evelyn unfolded the paper with trembling hands. Next week, she murmured, scanning the text. Her pulse quickened as she read the charges: gross misconduct, endangerment of patients, and violation of hospital protocol. They're not wasting any time, Linda said, her voice laced with concern. They want this swept under the rug before it gains traction. Evelyn's mind raced. She knew she had made the right call, but proving that to the board would be another matter entirely. The hospital was already painting her as reckless, a liability. And she had little doubt that Dr. Hayes and Karen Russell would ensure her actions were framed as dangerous rather than life-saving. A family in turmoil. Later that afternoon, Evelyn sat in her small apartment, staring at the framed photo of her parents on the mantel. They had always taught her to stand up for what was right, to protect the vulnerable, no matter the cost. But as she thought about the hospital's looming accusations, doubt began to creep in. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. When she opened it, she found James and Emily Carter, the parents of the twins, standing on her doorstep. Emily clutched a small blanket in her hands, her eyes red from crying. James stood stiffly beside her, his jaw clenched. "Mrs. Carter, Mr. Carter," Evelyn said, stepping aside to let them in. "Is everything okay?" Emily sat on the couch, gripping the blanket tightly. "We heard about the hearing," she said softly. "And we heard what they're saying about you." James remained standing, his posture rigid. "The hospital reached out to us," he said, his voice tight. "They're offering to cover Bella's medical expenses if we sign a statement against you." Evelyn's stomach dropped. She had anticipated pushback from the hospital, but using the Carters, manipulating their financial vulnerability, was a move she hadn't seen coming. "I don't know what to do," Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Bella wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. But the bills, we can't handle them on our own." Evelyn knelt in front of Emily, placing a hand on hers. "I understand how hard this is," she said gently. "But you need to know the truth. Bella's ventilator wasn't just malfunctioning the night I placed Ava with her. It had been flagged for months. The hospital knew about the problem and did nothing." Emily's eyes widened, and James's stern expression faltered. Evelyn pulled out a folder from her bag, filled with copies of maintenance logs and internal emails she had uncovered. She laid them on the coffee table, the damning evidence staring back at the Carters. "They're trying to blame me to cover their own negligence," Evelyn continued. "If you speak out, you could help expose what's really going on." James sat down heavily, running a hand through his hair. "This is a lot," he admitted, his voice shaking. "We're just trying to protect our family." "I know," Evelyn said, her voice soft but resolute. "But protecting Bella doesn't mean staying silent. It means making sure this never happens to another family." Emily looked down at the blanket in her hands, her tears soaking into the fabric. "You saved her," she whispered. "We'll do what's right." The backlash begins. The days leading up to the hearing were a blur of preparation and anxiety. Evelyn spent hours combing through her evidence, working closely with Sarah Collins, the lawyer Margaret had recommended. Sarah was sharp, her no-nonsense demeanor a perfect counterbalance to Evelyn's quiet determination. But the hospital wasn't sitting idly by. Articles began circulating, questioning Evelyn's judgment and professionalism. Anonymous sources painted her as a maverick nurse who often disregarded protocol. The comments stung, but Evelyn refused to let them break her. Her apartment became a fortress of paperwork, sticky notes, and legal pads. Every detail of her career, every decision she had ever made, was scrutinized under a harsh light. But through it all, Evelyn held on to the image of Bella and Ava lying side by side, their tiny hands intertwined. That moment, the miracle of it, was what gave her strength. The night before the hearing, Evelyn sat alone in her apartment, staring out the window at the city lights. Her phone buzzed with a message from Linda. "You've got this. We all believe in you." Evelyn smiled faintly, her heart swelling with gratitude. She wasn't alone in this fight. Margaret, Rebecca, Sarah, and now the Carters, they were all standing beside her. Together, they were stronger than the hospital's fear tactics and cover-ups. She picked up the photo of Ava and Bella that she kept on her desk. "I'll fight for you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "For both of you." Tomorrow, she would face the board. Tomorrow, she would stand up for what she believed in, no matter the cost. Because some things, like the lives of two tiny, fragile girls, were worth fighting for. Behind the curtain, the morning of the hearing dawned gray and overcast, a fitting backdrop to the storm brewing within the hospital's walls. Evelyn arrived early, her heart pounding as she passed through the sliding glass doors of the administrative wing. The sterile, brightly lit hallways felt foreign, almost hostile. Compared to the nurturing hum of the NICU, it wasn't just the room that had changed, it was the people. Colleagues she had worked alongside for years now avoided her gaze, their hurried footsteps echoing like accusations. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was oppressive. The long, polished table gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights, and a row of somber-faced board members sat at one end, their eyes sharp and unyielding. Karen Russell, the hospital administrator, sat poised and confident, her perfectly tailored suit and calm demeanor exuding authority. Dr. Hayes stood nearby, reviewing his notes with a frown etched deep into his face. Evelyn took a seat at the far end of the table, Sarah Collins by her side. The lawyer's crisp navy blazer and neat binder of evidence were a stark contrast to Evelyn's own frayed nerves. Sarah leaned over and whispered, "Remember, stick to the facts. Don't let them bait you." Evelyn nodded, gripping her folder of evidence tightly. She glanced at the clock on the wall. Each tick of the second hand felt like a countdown to judgment. "The hearing begins." Karen Russell opened the proceedings with a formal tone, her voice carrying over the soft murmur of those gathered. "Today's hearing concerns allegations of gross misconduct and violation of hospital protocol by Nurse Evelyn Shaw. The incident in question involves the Miller twins and Nurse Shaw's unauthorized actions." Dr. Hayes was the first to speak. He rose, adjusting his glasses as he addressed the room. "The protocols in place are designed to protect our most vulnerable patients. By disregarding those protocols, Nurse Shaw placed both infants at significant risk. While Bella's condition improved, this was sheer luck, not sound medical practice." He clicked through a PowerPoint presentation, displaying charts and graphs that painted Evelyn's actions as reckless. Each slide was a carefully curated argument against her, designed to discredit her judgment and decision-making. Karen Russell followed, her voice calm but pointed. "This hospital prides itself on maintaining the highest standards of care. When an employee disregards those standards, it jeopardizes not only patient safety, but also the trust of our community." Evelyn felt her stomach churn, but she refused to let their words shake her. She glanced at Sarah, who gave her a reassuring nod. When it was their turn, Sarah stood, her presence commanding the room. "While the hospital claims to prioritize safety," Sarah began, her voice clear and unwavering, "the evidence we've gathered tells a different story. Nurse Shaw acted out of necessity, addressing a situation created by systemic negligence." Sarah distributed copies of maintenance logs and internal emails to the board members. The room grew quiet as the documents were examined. Evelyn watched as furrowed brows replaced the board's initial stern expressions. "These logs show repeated equipment failures in the NICU," Sarah continued. "Reports of faulty ventilators were ignored for months, creating a dangerous environment for premature infants like the Miller twins. A surprising revelation." As the hearing progressed, Evelyn was called to speak. Her voice trembled at first, but she quickly found her footing. "Bella was dying," she began, her words heavy with emotion. "Her vitals were slipping away, and every intervention we tried failed. I felt the warmth in her hand, a spark of life that shouldn't have been there. And I knew, deep down, that she needed her sister." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I made that decision because I couldn't stand by and watch her die without trying everything in my power. It wasn't about breaking rules. It was about saving a life." Karen Russell interrupted, her tone icy. "And in doing so, you endangered another life. What if Ava had developed complications? What if your actions had caused a tragedy instead of a miracle?" Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. "What if the faulty ventilator had been repaired months ago? What if the hospital had prioritized patient safety over budget constraints? Bella's condition wasn't caused by my actions. It was caused by negligence." The room fell silent. Karen's composed mask slipped for a fraction of a second, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "The Carter family speaks." The turning point came when James and Emily Carter entered the room. Their presence was unexpected, and a murmur rippled through the crowd. Emily held a photograph of the twins, her hands trembling as she approached the table. "Before you judge Nurse Shaw," Emily said, her voice quivering but resolute, "you need to hear from us. the parents of the children she saved. James stood beside her, his expression guarded but supportive. "We were told to prepare for the worst," he began, his voice steady. "Bella was fading, and no one could tell us why. But Evelyn, she gave us hope when we had none." Emily held up the photograph, her tears glistening under the harsh lights. "This is Bella now. She's alive because Nurse Shaw believed in something that science couldn't explain. She trusted in the bond between our daughters." The board members exchanged glances, their stoic faces softening. Karen Russell shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers tapping against the table. "But it's not just about Bella," James added, his tone growing sharper. "We've seen the evidence. The ventilator that was supposed to keep our daughter alive was faulty. The hospital knew it and did nothing. You're blaming Evelyn to cover your own failures." The truth unfolds. As the hearing continued, Sarah presented a final piece of evidence, an email thread between Karen Russell and the hospital's maintenance department. The emails revealed deliberate delays in repairing the ventilators due to budget constraints. "This is the heart of the issue," Sarah said, her voice ringing with conviction. "Nurse Shaw's actions were not reckless. They were necessary. The real recklessness lies in the hospital's decision to prioritize finances over lives." The board members leaned back in their chairs, visibly shaken. One member, a distinguished woman with silver hair, spoke up. "Miss Russell, is this true? Did the hospital knowingly delay maintenance on critical equipment?" Karen's face turned ashen, and for the first time she faltered. I was following directives. It wasn't my decision alone." The room buzzed with whispers. Evelyn felt a surge of vindication, but she remained composed. This wasn't about personal victory. It was about justice for the patients she had dedicated her life to protecting. The aftermath. The hearing ended with the board chair announcing that they would review all evidence before making a final decision. Evelyn left the room exhausted but hopeful, her shoulders lighter than they had been in weeks. Outside, she was greeted by Emily and James, who hugged her tightly. "Thank you," Emily whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Not just for Bella, but for standing up for what's right." Linda and Rebecca joined her later that evening, their expressions triumphant. "You did it," Linda said, her voice brimming with pride. "You made them listen." As Evelyn drove home that night, the city lights blurred past her, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to hope. She had stood up to the system, and while the fight wasn't over, she knew she wasn't alone. Together, they had pulled back the curtain, exposing the truth and the power of love, determination, and courage to overcome even the darkest challenges. The ripple effect. The sun dipped below the horizon as Evelyn sat in her modest apartment, gazing out at the city's twinkling lights. The hearing was over, but the fight had only just begun. Her phone buzzed incessantly on the table beside her. A relentless stream of messages from journalists, former colleagues, and strangers who had heard about her case. Word had spread faster than she anticipated, and the world was beginning to take notice. Despite the support, Evelyn's heart was heavy. The board had yet to render its decision, and the hospital's administration was circling like vultures. Every step forward seemed to bring new challenges, and the weight of it all felt crushing. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to refocus. This wasn't about her reputation or her career. It was about protecting the lives of the tiniest, most vulnerable patients. She owed them her resolve. A community awakens. The next morning, Evelyn woke to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly. Groggily, she picked it up to find an onslaught of notifications. A video had gone viral overnight. Emily Carter had shared her family's story on social media, complete with a heartfelt plea for justice and a photo of Eva and Bella, now thriving side by side. In the video, Emily spoke directly to the camera, her voice cracking with emotion. "Bella wouldn't be here if it weren't for Nurse Evelyn Shaw. She defied the rules to save my daughter's life, and now the hospital is trying to punish her for it. But this isn't just about Evelyn. It's about a system that puts profits over people. This needs to stop." The response was overwhelming. Comments flooded in, filled with words of support and outrage. Nurses from across the country shared their own stories of systemic failures and the impossible choices they were forced to make. Parents posted photos of their NICU graduates, expressing gratitude for the tireless work of nurses like Evelyn. By noon, the story had been picked up by major news outlets. Reporters gathered outside the hospital, their cameras trained on the entrance. Evelyn watched the coverage from her living room, her hands trembling as she sipped her coffee. The narrative was shifting, and the hospital was scrambling to control the damage. The hospital fights back. In a desperate attempt to reclaim the narrative, Karen Russell held a press conference later that afternoon. Flanked by Dr. Hayes and other members of the administration, she stood at a podium adorned with the hospital's logo, her expression somber. "We understand the concerns raised by recent events," Karen began, her voice calm and measured. "Our hospital is committed to providing the highest standard of care for all our patients. While we respect the passion and dedication of our staff, we cannot condone actions that jeopardize patient safety." A reporter raised her hand. "Ms. Russell, what about the allegations of equipment failures in the ICU? Are you denying that these issues were known and ignored?" Karen's composure faltered for a moment before she replied. "We take all maintenance concerns seriously. Any claims suggesting otherwise will be thoroughly investigated. However, it's important to remember that medical decisions should always follow established protocols." Dr. Hayes stepped forward, his tone authoritative. "What happened with the Miller twins was an anomaly. While we're grateful for Bella's recovery, it's irresponsible to draw conclusions that undermine our procedures. Protocols exist for a reason." Evelyn watched the press conference with a mixture of anger and determination. Their polished statements couldn't erase the truth, and she was ready to prove it. Building the case. In the days that followed, Evelyn worked tirelessly with Sarah Collins and her growing team of allies. Margaret Walker and Rebecca Lee had come forward publicly, sharing their own experiences with the hospital's negligence. Other former employees followed suit, emboldened by the wave of support. Sarah turned Evelyn's apartment into a makeshift war room, the dining table buried under piles of documents and sticky notes. "We have a solid foundation," Sarah said, tapping a stack of maintenance logs. "But we need more. If we can find a direct link between the administration's decisions and patient harm, they won't be able to deny it." Linda, who had become an invaluable part of their team, leaned over the table, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I've been talking to some of the night shift nurses," she said. "They're scared, but a few are willing to share what they know." One of them mentioned something about a contractor who handles the ventilator repairs. Apparently, they flagged issues months ago, but nothing was done. Evelyn's eyes lit up. "If we can get a statement from the contractor, that could be the smoking gun. A dangerous discovery." The search for the contractor led Evelyn and Linda to a small repair shop on the outskirts of town. The owner, a wiry man in his 50s named Dave, was hesitant at first. He leaned against the counter, his hands stuffed into his grease-streaked coveralls, as he listened to their story. "I don't want any trouble," Dave said, shaking his head. "The hospital's one of my biggest clients. If they find out I talked to you." "They won't," Evelyn assured him. "But babies' lives are at stake, Dave. Bella's ventilator was faulty because someone ignored your warnings. How many more could be at risk?" Dave sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I sent them multiple reports," he admitted, pulling a binder from a shelf. "Documented every issue I found. But they kept telling me to hold off on repairs. Said they didn't have the budget." Evelyn's heart sank as she flipped through the binder. Each entry was a damning testament to the hospital's negligence. "This is exactly what we need," she said, her voice trembling with gratitude. "Thank you, Dave." As they left the shop, Linda turned to Evelyn, her expression grim. "You realize this makes you an even bigger target, right?" Evelyn nodded. "Let them come. The truth is worth it." A growing movement. By the end of the week, the public outcry had reached a fever pitch. Protests erupted outside the hospital, with supporters holding signs that read "Justice for Bella" and "Protect our patients." News outlets ran segments highlighting the systemic issues in healthcare, featuring interviews with nurses, parents, and former employees who had experienced similar failures. Evelyn became an unwitting symbol of the movement, her name trending on social media alongside hashtags like #NursesFightBack and #PatientsOverProfits. It was overwhelming, but it also gave her strength. For the first time, she felt like her voice was being heard. Inside the hospital, the administration was reeling. Karen Russell called an emergency meeting with the board, her polished demeanor cracking under the pressure. "We need to regain control," she said, her voice sharp. "This is spiraling out of hand." But the board members were no longer united in their support. Some, shaken by the mounting evidence, began to question the hospital's practices. "We can't sweep this under the rug," one member said. "If these allegations are true, we need to make changes immediately." A moment of resolve. Late one night, Evelyn sat alone in the NICU, watching over Ava and Bella. The twins were thriving, their soft breaths a comforting rhythm in the quiet room. Evelyn reached into the incubator and gently touched Bella's hand, marveling at the tiny miracle she had fought so hard to protect. "This isn't just about you," she whispered. "It's about every baby who comes through these doors. I'll keep fighting. For all of you." As she turned to leave, she caught her reflection in the glass. Her face was tired, lined with the strain of the past few weeks. But her eyes were fierce, burning with determination. She had come too far to back down now. The fight was far from over, but Evelyn knew she wasn't alone. With her allies by her side, and the truth on her side, she was ready to take on whatever came next. The ripple effect of her actions had grown into a wave, and it was unstoppable. The turning tide. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through Evelyn's bedroom window as she prepared for another grueling day. The hospital board's final decision loomed, and the weight of it pressed heavily on her chest. Yet, amidst the anxiety, there was a spark of hope. The voices of her allies, Margaret, Rebecca, Linda, and even the Carters, echoed in her mind, urging her forward. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling her from her thoughts. A message from Sarah Collins lit up the screen. "Meet me at the office. We have something big." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She grabbed her bag and rushed out the door, her determination outweighing her exhaustion. A breakthrough. Sarah's office was bustling when Evelyn arrived. The normally quiet space was filled with the hum of printers and the shuffle of papers as Sarah's team worked feverishly. Sarah met her at the door, her face alight with a mixture of urgency and excitement. "We've got them," Sarah said, her tone triumphant. She handed Evelyn a stack of documents, each one stamped with the hospital's logo. "These are internal financial reports, leaked anonymously. They show a deliberate pattern of diverting funds away from critical maintenance to executive bonuses and marketing campaigns." Evelyn's eyes widened as she flipped through the pages. Each line item was a damning indictment of the hospital's priorities. "This proves they knew," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They chose profit over safety." Sarah nodded. "It gets better. We also have a statement from Dave, the contractor, confirming that he flagged multiple issues with the ventilators and was told to delay repairs. He's willing to testify." Evelyn felt a surge of relief and gratitude. This could change everything. The Carter family takes a stand. Later that afternoon, Evelyn met with James and Emily Carter at a local coffee shop. The couple had been quiet since their powerful testimony at the hearing, but their presence in the fight had been crucial. As Evelyn approached their table, she noticed the exhaustion in their faces, tempered by a newfound resolve. "We've been talking," Emily began, her hands clasped tightly around a steaming cup of tea, "about what this fight means, not just for Bella, but for every family that comes after us." James nodded, his expression grim but determined. "We've decided to go public with everything. The hospital tried to buy our silence, but we can't let them get away with this. People need to know the truth." Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes. "Are you sure? This will put you in the spotlight." Emily reached across the table, taking Evelyn's hand. "You risked everything for Bella. The least we can do is stand with you." The three of them worked together, drafting a statement that outlined the hospital's failures and the Carters' unwavering support for Evelyn. By the time they finished, the weight of their shared determination filled the room. The public response. The Carter family's statement, combined with the leaked financial documents, hit the media like a tidal wave. News outlets ran with the story, their headlines growing more damning by the hour. Hospital scandal. Profits over patients. Nurse Evelyn Shaw fights back against corruption. Carter family exposes systemic negligence. Protests outside the hospital swelled in size, with signs reading "Justice for Evelyn" and "Protect our babies." Nurses from across the country shared their own stories of workplace failures, creating a groundswell of support for Evelyn and her cause. Inside the hospital, the administration was in chaos. Karen Russell and Dr. Hayes faced mounting pressure from both the public and the board. Whispered conversations in the halls grew louder, and the once unwavering support for the administration began to fracture. The board's emergency meeting. The hospital board called an emergency meeting to address the growing scandal. Evelyn and Sarah were invited to present their evidence, a sign that the tide was beginning to turn. The meeting took place in the hospital's largest conference room, packed with board members, reporters, and concerned staff. Evelyn stood at the head of the room, her hands gripping the edges of the podium. Her voice was steady as she outlined the hospital's systemic failures, her words bolstered by the overwhelming evidence Sarah had compiled. "These documents show a deliberate disregard for patient safety," Evelyn said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "The hospital prioritized profits over lives, and Bella Miller nearly paid the price." Sarah followed, presenting the financial records in Dave's testimony. "This isn't just negligence. It's a pattern of corruption. The people responsible must be held accountable." The board members exchanged hushed whispers, their expressions a mixture of shock and unease. The weight of the evidence was undeniable, and the room buzzed with the realization that the truth could no longer be ignored. The fallout. The board's decision came swiftly. Karen Russell was placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation, and Dr. Hayes resigned the following day. The hospital issued a public apology, pledging to overhaul its policies and prioritize patient safety. Evelyn's suspension was lifted, and she was offered a formal apology from the board. Though the vindication was gratifying, Evelyn knew the fight wasn't over. She had won a battle, but the war for systemic change in healthcare was far from finished. As she walked out of the hospital that evening, the cool night air filled her lungs, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace. The path ahead was uncertain, but she was ready to face it with the same courage that had brought her this far. A new beginning. The NICU was quieter than Evelyn remembered as she returned to her post. Bella and Ava were thriving, their tiny forms nestled side by side in their incubator. Evelyn stood over them, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. Linda approached, a warm smile on her face. "Welcome back," she said, placing a hand on Evelyn's shoulder. "We missed you." Evelyn smiled, her eyes never leaving the twins. "It's good to be home." As she resumed her duties, Evelyn knew that her journey had only just begun. The events of the past weeks had changed her forever, igniting a fire within her to continue fighting for the most vulnerable. The ripple effect of her actions had grown into a movement, and she was ready to lead the charge. Because sometimes doing the right thing meant standing up against impossible odds and winning. A widening movement. The day Evelyn returned to the NICU, her heart was both full and heavy. Bella and Ava's survival had become a symbol of hope, but the scars of the battle she had fought for them, and for the truth, were still raw. Nurses greeted her cautiously, their faces betraying a mix of admiration and uncertainty. Some smiled warmly, others avoided her gaze entirely. The ripple effects of her actions were still reverberating through the hospital's corridors. As she approached the twins' incubator, Evelyn noticed Emily Carter sitting beside it. Emily held Ava's tiny hand, her soft whispers carrying the kind of hope that had once felt impossible. Bella stirred in her sleep, her fragile chest rising and falling with steady breaths. Evelyn placed a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. "They're thriving," she said, her voice warm but edged with emotion. "You've been their strength." Emily looked up, tears glistening in her eyes. "We couldn't have done this without you," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. "You didn't just save Bella. You gave us our family back." For a moment, Evelyn allowed herself to feel the weight of those words. This was why she had fought so hard, why she had risked everything. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The backlash grows. Evelyn's reinstatement didn't sit well with everyone. While many celebrated her courage, others saw her as a threat to the hospital's stability. The administrative staff was still reeling from the fallout, and whispers of resentment echoed in the break rooms and hallways. Linda, ever a pillar of support, kept Evelyn informed of the undercurrents. "They're scared of you," she said one evening as they shared coffee in the break room. "You've exposed too much, and they don't know how to handle it." Evelyn sighed, swirling the coffee in her mug. "I didn't do this to make enemies, Linda. I did it because it was the right thing to do. And that's exactly why you're dangerous to them," Linda replied, her tone a mix of admiration and concern. Evelyn's phone buzzed on the counter. It was another message from Sarah. "New updates. Meet me at the office ASAP. A broader issue emerges." When Evelyn arrived at Sarah's office, the atmosphere was tense. Rebecca Lee and Margaret Walker were already there, their faces set with grim determination. A map of the country hung on the wall, dotted with red pins. Evelyn's stomach churned as she realized what the pins represented. "These are hospitals reporting similar issues," Sarah explained, gesturing to the map. "Faulty equipment, budget cuts, staff being silenced. It's not just here, it's everywhere." Evelyn's throat tightened. How is this happening on such a scale? Rebecca, who had been quiet, spoke up. "Because it's profitable. Cutting corners, delaying repairs. It saves money in the short term, and the people at the top reap the benefits. Meanwhile, the patients and staff pay the price." Margaret nodded. "We've started hearing from other nurses and healthcare workers across the country. They're sharing their stories, looking for guidance. This is bigger than any of us thought." Sarah leaned forward, her voice low but intense. "This isn't just about fixing one hospital, Evelyn. This is about systemic change, and it starts with us." The birth of a movement. Over the next few weeks, Evelyn found herself at the center of a growing movement. Nurses, doctors, and patients from across the country reached out, sharing their own experiences of negligence and corruption in the healthcare system. Social media campaigns gained traction, with hashtags like #HealthcareJustice and #EvelynsFight trending nationwide. Evelyn began attending community meetings and speaking at events, her voice carrying the weight of her experiences. She shared Bella and Ava's story, using it as a powerful reminder of what was at stake. "This isn't just about equipment or budgets," she said at one rally, her voice strong and clear. "This is about human lives, about ensuring that every child, every patient, gets the care they deserve." The movement grew rapidly, fueled by grassroots efforts and a shared sense of urgency. Petitions were circulated, demanding accountability from hospitals and healthcare corporations. News outlets continued to cover the story, bringing national attention to the issue. A personal sacrifice. While the movement gained momentum, Evelyn's personal life began to feel the strain. She spent long hours organizing, speaking, and fighting for change, often leaving little time for herself. The constant scrutiny and pressure took a toll, but she refused to back down. One evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, Evelyn's phone buzzed with a text from her sister, Claire. "Haven't seen you in weeks. Let's grab dinner soon. Miss you." Evelyn stared at the message, guilt washing over her. She had always been close to Claire, but the past few months had created a distance she hadn't intended. Picking up the phone, she dialed her sister's number. "Hey," she said when Claire answered. "I miss you too. Let's get dinner tomorrow." A glimmer of change. Despite the challenges, Evelyn began to see signs of progress. The hospital's new administration implemented stricter policies for equipment maintenance and began investing in staff training. Other hospitals followed suit, wary of being exposed in the wake of Evelyn's case. Bella and Ava's story continued to inspire, serving as a beacon of hope for families and healthcare workers alike. Emily and James Carter became advocates for the movement, using their platform to push for transparency and reform. One evening, Evelyn received a letter from a nurse in another state. It read, "Thank you for being brave enough to stand up for what's right. Because of you, our hospital is changing its practices, and I finally feel like I can make a difference. You're not just fighting for your patients, you're fighting for all of us." Evelyn held the letter close, her eyes filling with tears. It was a reminder of why she had started this fight and why she would continue, no matter the cost. The legacy of courage. Months later, as Evelyn stood in the NICU watching Bella and Ava take their first steps toward recovery, she felt a profound sense of peace. The battle she had fought had been grueling, but it had been worth it. Lives had been saved, systems had been challenged, and the seeds of change had been planted. Linda approached, placing a hand on Evelyn's shoulder. "You did it," she said softly. Evelyn shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "We did it. Together." As she looked around the room, at the dedicated nurses, the thriving twins, and the hopeful parents, Evelyn knew that this was only the beginning. The fight for justice and integrity in healthcare was far from over, but she was ready to face whatever came next. Because some battles are worth fighting and winning. The new horizon. The morning air was crisp and clean, the kind that hinted at change. Evelyn stood outside the hospital, watching the sun rise over the skyline. It had been 6 months since her hearing, 6 months since she had risked her career, her reputation, and her sense of safety to expose the systemic failures within the healthcare system. Now she was returning to the NICU with a new purpose and a renewed sense of hope. The lobby bustled with activity as Evelyn walked through the familiar halls. The air felt different, lighter somehow. Staff members greeted her with nods of respect, and even those who had once doubted her now offered small smiles. The movement she had sparked had grown beyond her imagination, and the changes were already evident. As she reached the NICU, Evelyn paused, taking a moment to savor the sight of the vibrant unit. It was no longer just a room filled with machines and fragile lives. It was a symbol of resilience and progress. She smiled as she stepped inside, ready to continue the work she loved. A changed environment. Inside the NICU, the transformation was undeniable. New equipment gleamed under the bright lights, the result of the hospital's renewed commitment to patient safety. Maintenance schedules were prominently displayed on the walls, and the staff had undergone extensive training in using the new technology. Linda greeted her with a warm hug. "Welcome back," she said, her eyes twinkling with pride. "You've missed a lot, but it feels right having you here again." Evelyn glanced around the room, her heart swelling as she watched the nurses working with precision and care. "It feels like a different place," she said softly. "It is," Linda replied. "You made them listen. And not just here. Hospitals all over are reevaluating their practices because of you." Evelyn's gaze fell on Ava and Bella's incubator. The twins were no longer the fragile infants she had once cradled. They were thriving now, their tiny bodies stronger, their futures brighter. Emily and James Carter stood nearby, beaming as they watched their daughters. When they saw Evelyn, they waved her over. The Carter family's gratitude. "Evelyn," Emily said, her voice filled with emotion, "we don't have the words to thank you for what you've done, not just for our family, but for so many others." James nodded, his usually stoic demeanor softened. "You fought for Bella when no one else did. You gave her a chance when it seemed like there wasn't one. Evelyn knelt by the incubator, her fingers lightly brushing Bella's tiny hand. She fought, too, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Both of them did. All I did was give them the chance they deserved. Emily placed a hand on Evelyn's shoulder. You did so much more than that. You've changed lives. You've changed us. Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes as she stood. Thank you for believing in me, she said. It's families like yours that remind me why this work matters. The movement expands. The ripple effects of Evelyn's actions had grown into a full-blown wave of change. Nurses, doctors, and patients across the country had rallied together, demanding better standards and accountability in healthcare. Advocacy groups sprang up, inspired by Evelyn's courage, and legislative efforts to address systemic issues gained traction. Evelyn was invited to speak at conferences where she shared her story and the lessons she had learned. Her message was clear. Healthcare was about more than policies and profits. It was about people. Her words resonated, sparking conversations and igniting a passion for reform in countless hearts. At one such event, Evelyn stood on a stage before a packed auditorium. Behind her, a large screen displayed a photo of Bella and Ava, now smiling and healthy. She took a deep breath and began. We are entrusted with the most precious lives, and with that trust comes responsibility. It is our duty to speak up when something is wrong, to fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. Change is never easy, but it is always possible, and it starts with each of us. The audience erupted into applause, and Evelyn felt a surge of hope. The fight was far from over, but the movement had momentum, and it wasn't slowing down. Rebuilding relationships. Amid the whirlwind of change, Evelyn worked to rebuild her personal life. She reconnected with her sister, Claire, who had been one of her strongest supporters throughout the ordeal. Over dinner one evening, Claire raised a toast. To my brave sister, she said, her voice filled with pride. You've always had the biggest heart, and now the world knows it. Evelyn laughed, her cheeks flushing. It wasn't just me, she said. I had so many people standing with me. And you'll have even more going forward, Claire replied. This is just the beginning. Evelyn also reconnected with colleagues who had once doubted her. Slowly, the walls of mistrust began to crumble as they saw the changes her actions had brought. The NICU team became stronger, united by a shared commitment to their patients, a vision for the future. Months later, Evelyn sat in a meeting with hospital leadership, including new administrators who had been brought in to oversee the reforms. Together, they discussed plans for continued improvements, from updated protocols to increased transparency. We want to learn from what happened, one of the administrators said. Your insights have been invaluable, Evelyn. We'd like you to help us shape the future of this hospital. Evelyn felt a mix of pride and humility. I'll do whatever I can, she said, but it's going to take all of us working together to make lasting change. As the meeting ended, Evelyn stepped outside into the cool evening air. The hospital loomed behind her, a reminder of the battles she had fought and the lives she had touched. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to face it. A legacy of courage. 1 year after the hearing, Evelyn returned to the NICU on a quiet evening. The room was peaceful, the soft beeping of monitors a comforting rhythm. She stood by Bella and Ava's crib, watching them sleep. Their growth was a testament to the resilience of life and the power of love. Linda approached, holding a clipboard. They're asking for you in the break room, she said, a twinkle in her eye. Don't keep them waiting. Curious, Evelyn followed her. When she entered the room, she was met with cheers and applause. The NICU staff had gathered, a cake on the table with the words, "Thank you, Evelyn," written in frosting. Tears filled her eyes as Linda handed her a small plaque. Engraved on it were the words, "For courage, compassion, and commitment. You remind us what it means to care." Evelyn smiled through her tears, her heart full. She had never sought recognition, only justice. But in that moment, she realized the impact of her actions. the lives she had changed, the hope she had inspired. As she left the hospital that night, the stars above seemed brighter, the world quieter. Evelyn knew her fight wasn't over, but she also knew she wasn't alone. Together, they had started a movement, one that would continue to grow and transform the healthcare system. Because change begins with one person, but it takes a community to sustain it. And Evelyn was ready to lead the way into a new horizon. A ripple becomes a wave. The celebration in the NICU break room was both humbling and energizing for Evelyn. It wasn't just about her. It was about all of them. Every nurse, doctor, and administrator who had chosen to fight for better care had contributed to the movement that was reshaping their hospital and rippling out into the larger healthcare world. As the evening wore on, Evelyn found herself standing with Linda and Margaret in a quiet corner, away from the laughter and chatter. Margaret, her silver hair catching the light, gave Evelyn a proud smile. "You've done something extraordinary," Margaret said, her voice soft but steady. "When I left, I thought nothing would change. You proved me wrong." Evelyn shook her head. "We all did this, Margaret. I couldn't have done it without you, without Linda, without everyone who stood up." Linda raised her coffee cup in a mock toast to raising hell for the right reasons. The three women laughed, the kind of laughter born from relief and camaraderie, and Evelyn felt a warmth in her chest she hadn't felt in months. But even as they celebrated, Evelyn's mind wandered to the larger fight ahead, a call to action. 2 weeks after the NICU celebration, Evelyn received an unexpected email. It was an invitation to testify before a congressional subcommittee on healthcare reform. The movement she had sparked had reached Washington, and policymakers were taking notice. Sarah Collins was the first person Evelyn called. "Do you think I should do it?" she asked, pacing her apartment. "Absolutely," Sarah replied without hesitation. "This is your chance to take what we've done here and make it bigger. You've got the evidence, the story, and the credibility. They need to hear you." Evelyn agreed, though her nerves prickled at the thought. The idea of speaking in front of lawmakers, under the scrutiny of cameras and reporters, was daunting. But she reminded herself that this wasn't about her. It was about the patients, the families, and the healthcare workers who deserved better.